All right, welcome back. And here is lecture 2 from topic 7, chapter 13, the presidency. Okay, in this lecture, we're going to dig in and we're going to take a look at the expressed powers of the presidency. That is, those powers that are exclusive to the president of the United States alone. And we find those powers in Article 2, Section 2 and 3 of the United States Constitution. And I really encourage you to take a look at those two sections in Article 2. The Constitution, you can find it online, but it's also in the back of your textbook. And so, read that because it's going to at least show you where it is in the Constitution and all the different powers that we're going to be talking about. Now, on the side here, I have this completely dorky, here, let me put on my magic pen. I have this completely dorky picture, okay? And I made this slide last year, and I was like, man, this year I got to come up with a better image, but I couldn't find anything better. So we're going to stick with it. So you're like, hey, Professor Hankinson, why do you have that human with all of the hats on their body? And the reason I have that there is because a lot of times when we think about the power of the president, that Article 2, Section 2 and 3 gives the president a lot of different powers. And so there are a lot of different hats that the president wears. They wear their military hat. They wear their diplomatic hat. They wear their judge's hat, right, etc. All these things we're going to be learning about, okay? And so there's a constant reminder with the dorky picture of the president and all the hats that person wears. And so we're going to be talking about the military power, the judicial power, the diplomatic power, the executive power, and the legislative power. And we'll look at those in detail, and you'll read about them in even more detail in your textbook. So let's get started. Okay, so let's start with the military powers of the presidency, because that's the powers of the presidency that you might be most familiar with. So Article 2, Section 2 tells us that the President of the United States is the commander-in-chief. And what that basically means is that the President of the United States is the highest military authority. And keep in mind that the President of the United States is a civilian. He's the civilian head, or the commander-in-chief is not a member of the military, but they're actually a civilian. And the framers wanted to make sure that the person that was in control of military power wasn't a member of the military. They didn't want them to be a general. They wanted them to be looking at the use of military power from a non-military perspective. And so these are vast powers that are contained in the commander-in-chief powers. That they have military authority over the armies, the Navy, all of the institutions of the military, but they also have control over the entire defense establishment. And so the National Intelligence Network, such as the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council, the NSA, but also the FBI as well. As a Department of Justice, the FBI can be utilized in order to protect the United States from military insurrection or terrorist events within the borders of the United States. And so the commander-in-chief power is very large. The president also has domestic military powers, and the domestic military powers actually come from Article 4 of the Constitution, that says that the president has the power to protect states from invasion and domestic violence. And so the president can mobilize the National Guard in states in order to protect against states from harm. You can read more about the domestic military power in the textbook. Oftentimes it's used during emergencies, so during hurricane or wildfires and those sorts of environmental related harmful events. But they can also be used historically as a way of making sure that judicial orders are followed. And so they use the example in 1957 when President Eisenhower sent troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, because the governor of Arkansas refused to follow the judicial orders to desegregate their schools. And so that's a good example of that domestic military power. Now, all the powers that we're going to be learning about in this lecture, we're going to talk about how at least the vast majority of these powers have some checks on them. And so putting that in the category of checks and balances. That again, the framers wanted to make sure that the president had power, but they didn't want it to be unilateral power. They wanted that power to be checked. And so while the president is the commander over the military, Congress is the only one who has the power to declare war. And so while the president can mobilize troops for a specific period of time, you'll be reading about the War Powers resolution in your textbook, that after a certain period of time, the president must come back and get authorization from the Congress to continue keeping those troops overseas. And when it comes to war, only Congress can declare war. Congress also has the power to raise armies and navies. And so that they have, while the president rules over the military establishment, the Congress has the ability to increase or decrease the military establishment as it sees fit. And Congress has the power of the purse. And so wars cost money, mobilization of troops cost money, and so that Congress can decide to spend or not spend on military endeavors as it sees fits. Now, contemporary presidency, oftentimes the Congress just abdicates its war powers to the president. War has not been declared in the United States since World War II. And so the Korean War, Vietnam War, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, none of those were declared wars. And so the balance of power and the checks and balance on the military powers of the president have really sort of waned, particularly in the mid part of the 20th century and beyond. The next constitutional power we're going to talk about is judicial powers. And a lot of students, so maybe the hat that person should be wearing is a judge's hat, although our hats don't wear judges, they wear robes. Maybe they could wear a wig, like a judicial wig from the good old days. But a lot of times students get judicial power confused with the power to appoint judges. And while the president does have the power to appoint federal judges, that falls in the category of executive power, not judicial power. Judicial power is the power that the president has to actually act like a judge, right? To actually, the judge in the criminal justice system is the one who sentences people for the crimes that they've been convicted of. So in the Constitution, the framers gave the president the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in the case of impeachment. And so what does that mean? Well, if an individual has been convicted of a federal offense, and so if you're convicted of a state offense, and the vast majority of offenses are at the state level, but if you're convicted of a federal crime, drug trafficking, sex trafficking, killing a federal officer, whatever that federal crime is, then the president has the power to either pardon you completely from that conviction and sentence. And so, but when you're pardoned, that conviction is basically erased from your record. It's as if that conviction never took place. Also, presidents have the power to reprieve people. They can say the conviction is going to stay on your record, but you've been sentenced and I'm giving you a reprieve from that sentence. In other words, I'm saying that you do not have to serve your sentence, or you no longer have to continue serving your sentence. This is a really interesting power that the framers gave the president because it's unconditional. There is no check on the reprieve and pardon powers of the president, and that this power can and is misused. So, for example, when Bill Clinton was president of the United States, he pardoned his brother, Roger Clinton, from federal drug offenses. President Trump was criticized for pardoning a lot of his close associates, Roger Stone, Steve Bannon, Paul Manafort. And there's no check on that. The president has this unconditional judicial power of granting reprieves and pardons. So why the heck did the framers, who were so concerned about unilateral power and the abuse of power, why the heck did the framers endow the president with these unilateral judicial powers? Well, one reason they gave is because they felt that sometimes injustices do happen. and that power can be abused by when the Congress passes laws. They could be unjust laws. When the courts sentence people to a sentence, those could be unjust sentences. In fact, a lot of times we have sentencing laws that guide the hands of judges in terms of the sentences that they give. Well, those can all be unjust laws or unjust sentences. And so this gives the president the power to correct those injustices. An early example of that is the Alien and Sedition Act that was passed in 1798. This was an act that made it a federal offense to basically criticize the federal government, and that act was passed by the Federalist Party because they were really worried about the rise of Thomas Jefferson's party was the Democratic Republican Party, and the Democratic Republicans were criticizing the Federalist president and the Federalist Party's, lawmakers. And so basically they said that if you criticize them, if newspapers criticized them, that was seen as an act of sedition, and they were charged and incarcerated. And so when Jefferson got into office, he basically said, look, the press has freedom of the press. It's guaranteed in our Constitution. And those laws were a violation of the freedom of the press. So he pardoned those who had been targeted by the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798. When it comes to correcting other injustices, more contemporary examples, both President Obama and President Trump provided reprieves for people that were associated with federal drug sentencing laws. And so for those of you who are in my criminal justice class, and I think many of us know that when it comes to federal drug offenses, sometimes the sentences are really, really long. And so both President Obama and President Trump stepped in and reprieved people who had been sentenced to unjust long sentences for their activities in the drug trade. They also gave this power to the president because they felt that it served as a pressure valve. In other words, like when tons of pressure was building up in the country, like anger, discord, that presidents can take this sort of unilateral action judicially, and that it can kind of release some of that pressure. And so the example that they provide, or the example I'll provide, is the pardoning of Nixon. So Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon because it was such a point of contention. And he was just like, we need to move on as a nation. And Jimmy Carter pardoned the draft dodgers, those who dodged the draft during the Vietnam War. And had gone to Canada and they couldn't come back to the United States. Jimmy Carter pardoned those people, basically saying, look, we need to come back to together as a unified nation following sort of the harms and concerns about the Vietnam War. So those are two good examples of how the reprieve and pardon power can serve as a release of pressure. Okay, so let's talk about the diplomatic powers of the president. Oftentimes, the President of the United States is referred to as the head of state. Well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that we have many countries in the world, and each of those countries have a person that represents that country on the world stage. And for the United States, that person is the President of the United States. So, for example, this weekend, President Joe Biden is going to be attending an international conference on climate change, and he will be representing the United States and the interests of the United States as it relates to concerns about climate change within the world. And so what is it in the Constitution that establishes this sort of chief diplomatic status? Well, for one thing, the President of the United States is the one who receives ambassadors and public ministers from other countries. And so when another country comes to us and says that we would like to have our ambassador visit, that they acknowledge that that ambassador is actually the ambassador that is from the other country, and then welcomes them in order to begin any sort of diplomatic endeavors between the United States and that other country. As the head of state, too, the president welcomes other heads of states. So oftentimes, when a head of state comes from another country, there will be a big state dinner at the White House that basically wines and dines the head of state in order to develop a good relationship with that country in order to engage in some treaties. And that's another power that the Constitution gives to president as it relates to these diplomatic powers. Only the President of the United States has the power to negotiate treaties with other countries. And so that's a power that's exclusive to the President of the United States. A treaty is basically an agreement between one country and another country or a group of other countries. And so sometimes the treaties will have to do with improving the economy. And so we have a treaty that's between the United States, Mexico, and Canada in order to improve trade relations between those North American countries. We also are a member of a treaty organization called NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it is a treaty organization of over 20 European countries. It was developed after World War II in a way to protect those countries that were aligned during World War II from any attacks from unaligned countries. And so the treaties can be military in nature as well. Your textbook talks about other diplomatic powers. One is that if there's a shift of government in a foreign country, that it's the president that will acknowledge the legitimacy of a newly formed government. Are there checks on these powers? There are. One of the major checks on the powers is the treaty power. That while the president is the only one who can negotiate those treaties, the Senate provides their consent for those treaties. So the Senate needs to approve those treaties with a 2/3 vote. So there is some check on the power, that treaty power of the presidency, and that comes through the Senate. Another hat that the president wears is his or her CEO hat. And that relates to the president's executive powers. The president is, for all practical purposes, the chief executive officer of the federal government. In other words, that when it comes to the execution of laws, that the president the buck stops with the president, right? And so as you'll be learning about in the textbook, that we do have the president of the United States, but there's this whole federal bureaucracy that helps the president do the job of faithfully executing the laws of the United States. And so you'll be reading about that in the textbook. And so there are 15 federal departments: the Department of State, the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, the Department of Health and Human Services. The list goes on. And basically, the president is the CEO over all of that federal bureaucracy. Again, you'll be learning about that more in your chapter. And so the powers that are granted to the president as CEO, as chief executive officer, is that the president is responsible for appointing, removing, and supervising all executive officers. And so the president nominates people to serve as the Secretary of Defense. They nominate ambassadors, part of the Department of State. They nominate all, the higher level positions within the federal bureaucracy. And that's a power that is granted to the president. They also serve at the pleasure of the president. And so the president can remove those folks if they don't like the job that the director of the FBI is doing, or if they don't like the job that the Attorney General, the head of the Department of Justice, is doing, or they don't like the job that the Secretary of Defense is doing. The president has the unilateral power to remove that person, just like any CEO would have. Another aspect of the executive power extends to the federal judiciary. And so the president nominates justices to serve on the federal bench. We oftentimes hear about those nominations to the Supreme Court, the 9 justices that serve on the Supreme Court. But there are hundreds of federal judges that serve in the federal trial courts, known as the district courts, and the federal lower appellate courts. We'll be learning about that next week. And so the president, as CEO, is also has the power to nominate justices. There are checks on these powers. And so the Senate, with their advice and consent power, approves all federal appointments, including judges. Okay, so the president nominates the Secretary of State, but the Senate approves. The president nominates a justice of the Supreme Court, but the Senate approves. Okay, so there's most often some checks on these powers of the president. The final power we're going to talk about is the legislative power. So one of the many hats that the president wears is the chief lawmaking hat. In other words, that when it comes to making laws, while we do have Congress and they have the authority to propose bills, the president plays a pretty big role in influencing the kinds of bills that get proposed by Congress and then ultimately signed into law by the president. There's different ways that the president does this, and I'll talk about these first two, but we'll start with the legislative agenda first. And I'll use a concrete example with President Biden. So when presidents run for office, when they campaign, whether they're campaigning for the first time or whether they're campaigning for re-election, they run on a specific legislative agenda. They basically say that these are the things that if you elect or re-elect me for president, these are the things I'm going to achieve legislatively. And the Build Back Better Act, that's the act that's having a hard time getting through Congress right now. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, what the Build Back Better Act is it's legislation that Congress hopes to pass and that the president would sign into law that provides like an increase in the social safety net for people in the United States. And so it is proposing paid leave for family paid leave for if you get pregnant and you have to take care of a child, or paid family leave to take care of an elderly. It's looking at the expansion of universal pre-K so that parents can send their child to kindergarten, starting around the age of 3, expanding the educational access that children have, expanding dental, vision care for older people who are on Medicare, et cetera, and also provisions to help the climate. So there's this huge legislative agenda that President Biden ran on. And when he got elected, he was like, we're going to put that legislative agenda into action. And he's trying his darndest to do it, but, he's running up against conflict within his own party, within both the House, but primarily in the Senate. And whether or not he gets reelected as president really has to do with his ability. And it's not just him, it's any president's ability to get their legislative agenda through. And so that in a way, they're the chief lawmaker because they are shaping what kind of bills are proposed in Congress. Oftentimes, the State of the Union is another way that the president can communicate both to Congress and to the nation what are their priorities in terms of what they want Congress to get done. Ultimately, no law gets passed unless the president signs that bill into law. And so if the president doesn't like the proposed bill that's passed both the House and the Senate, they can veto that. So they can exercise that exclusive veto power. And then you'll read about it in your textbook, another sort of legislative power that the president has, and it's known as an executive order. Basically, what an executive order is that it is an order that the president of the United States can implement. It doesn't have to go through Congress, but it's just an order that the president signs. And that basically it is a way of managing the operations of the federal government or any activities that are related to the constitutional powers of the presidency. And so good examples of executive orders, one is the Emancipation Proclamation. That was an executive order, basically emancipating the slaves that were in the Confederate States. Truman desegregated the armed forces. And so the armed forces are underneath the purview, the executive power of the president. And so Truman passed an executive order in order to say that all federal troops must be desegregated. So you can't have platoons for black soldiers and platoons for white soldiers, that they were desegregated. And so you'll read more about those executive orders, and it is sort of like a legislative power because it's the power that the president can act in terms of making rules and sort of quasi laws that impact the functioning of the federal bureaucracy. There are checks, as there are on all these powers, there are checks on legislative powers. For one, if the president vetoes a proposed bill, then the Congress can override that veto with a 2/3 vote that has to take place in both the House and the Senate. And also, executive orders can be found to be unconstitutional. And so just because a president signs an executive order doesn't mean that there's no check on that. Sometimes executive orders are deemed as being unconstitutional. Usually, executive order has to be related to an actual federal law that Congress passed and delegated power to the president to implement. They also have to be within the constitutional powers of the presidency. A good example of an executive order that was deemed unconstitutional was an executive order that Harry Truman passed. Basically, he had an executive order that ordered private steel production facilities to be seized and used in order to fight the Korean War. And the Supreme Court came back and they said, nope, that executive order was unconstitutional because it was beyond the powers that were granted to the president by the Constitution. Okay. All right. So that's it. Thanks for listening. And a question like this will be on the final exam. I'm sure you don't want to think about the final exam, but that, a question that's going to basically be looking at and evaluating the constitutional powers, the institutional powers, and also how those powers have changed over time. Thanks for your attention, and I'll talk to you again soon.